And now I am very excited to introduce our keynote speaker. In anticipation of our 40th anniversary, Preservation Pennsylvania recently approved a new strategic plan. As we worked on the event to kick off our anniversary celebration, we knew we wanted a speaker who would inspire us not only to look back, but also to look forward and to challenge us in how to think about historic preservation as we move forward. Bonnie McDonald aspires to shape preservation into a more relevant and just practice. As president and CEO of Landmarks Illinois, Bonnie advances the vision, mission, and programs of Illinois' only statewide preservation nonprofit organization. Her transformative thinking about preservation has led the organization to focus its work on people and their important connection to historic places. She is currently spearheading the organization's evolution as it celebrates 50 years to enhance its relevance and to create a national model for justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity in the preservation practice. Bonnie is a collaborative leader, and together with her board, team, and volunteers, have nearly doubled LI's staff, opened its first regional office, passed vital state legislation, and played a visible role as thought leaders during her 9 years as president. From 2018 to 2021, Bonnie served as the board chair of the National Preservation Partners Network, the national nonprofit representing preservation organizations. And she was awarded the James Marston Fitz Charitable Foundation Mid-Career Fellowship in 2020 to write a guidebook to relevancy in the preservation movement. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot appointed Bonnie co-chair of the Chicago Monuments Project in 2020 to help lead a truth and racial reckoning process in the city around problematic artworks. Bonnie received a bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in historic preservation planning from Cornell University. Bonnie is exactly the inspiration we need as we embark on our 20th anniversary. At any time during Bonnie's talk, feel free to go type a question into the chat or to use the question and answer function. We have left time at the end for questions. Please welcome Bonnie McDonald.
Margaret, thank you so very much for that warm introduction on an albeit cold day coming to you from Chicago, everyone. So it's such a pleasure to be with you and really to be a part of this wonderful celebration of the 40th anniversary of Preservation Pennsylvania. So let me make sure that you get a good view of the presentation here, and I'm excited to talk with you about this. It's a true pleasure to be here with you and to be talking about a project that I've been working on for several years with many, many people, as is the work of Preservation Pennsylvania. So I just want to take a moment to truly thank Margaret, the board of Preservation Pennsylvania, and Mindy for this invitation to talk about this project. And also, I'd like to congratulate them for their 40th anniversary and to congratulate the award winners, Seidel and Jeff. You are an inspiration. Just hearing you today, you are giving us wisdom and showing us how we can improve this work, how we can make our work more relevant. So thank you for being an inspiration to me in this presentation as well. I would also like to take a moment to say thank you to my colleague and my friend, Mindy Crawford, for her leadership, for her vision, her creativity, and her dedication. This work can be very difficult, as many of you know, and Mindy continues to press forward with her dedication to Preservation Pennsylvania. So I just want to say thank you to her for this honor and let her know that she is an inspiration to me as well. So that word relevance, it comes up quite a bit in our daily life. We hear about things being relevant or irrelevant. And depending on what it is at any one moment, it could be relevant at one time and the next day it is deemed irrelevant. That is usually in the context of social media or if we're talking about the latest trend. But the project that I've worked on is really not about trends, and it's not about even being socially acceptable, as you see this definition here. Why I wanted to look at preservation is to see truly how applicable it is going to continue to be in the future. I do believe that preservation has been a relevant practice for the 100+ years that we have been helping people save places around this nation, and of course, people around the world. But I've observed in my own 20+ year career in historic preservation, the challenges that we just continue to face. Some of those that you've heard about in the video today, and I'm sure that you've seen in Preservation Pennsylvania's news alerts and newsletters as well. So my observations are really that preservation is not always the right solution to a problem. And I think Jeff noted in his acceptance speech that, you know, sometimes we have that noble loss instead of the compromised victory. And at times, as I've noticed in my career, preservation could even be part of the problem. And that has deeply concerned me as these observations have just cumulatively pointed out the change that is needed in preservation, in my belief. And truly, what I have come to feel is a relevancy crisis in our organization, in preservation practice. So in this presentation, I do want to illustrate for you, give you some specifics. As we talk about strategy, I also want to get into the tactical so that you can understand even further my concerns. This is an example here of a project that we worked on at Landmarks, Illinois called the Harley Clark Mansion. It's located in Evanston, Illinois. Some of you may have heard of that, the location of Northwestern University. And this building is a local landmark. It is listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and it's owned by the city of Evanston itself. And here we were facing the city trying to demolish its own landmark when it became vacant, and the city really lacked creativity, lacked drive in trying to find an adaptive reuse. And it's just indicative of, as I said, this cumulative list of things that I've noticed over this history in my career. And, you know, some of those include, for example, not only seeing cities trying to demolish their own landmarks, but cities devaluing or actually denigrating their own preservation ordinances. Some of them trying to abolish them entirely. We see places trying to delist historic districts. The decimation of our incentives. As we know, we've had to fight to keep the federal historic tax credit several times. We lost the 10% historic or non-historic tax credit. We also have seen the budgets cut at our state historic preservation offices, at least in our region here in the Midwest. And many of our preservation partners have really struggled to make ends meet financially. And from that, we have a large degree of burnout, unfortunately, in our field as well. So you add these together over time, and it leads one to be concerned. I just want to say this is not a presentation about hopelessness, not at all. I'll end on a hopeful note. But it is to say that I was inspired to do something about it to the degree that I can. And it's the people that I work with that truly inspire me to take steps forward. Those people like Seidel and Jeff and Mindy and Margaret who decide to take steps on their own, to be bold, to be brave, and to fight for the things that we feel are important to people, people's right to place, essentially. And here I list out one of the advocates for the Harley Clark Mansion, Carl Klein, who is a member of our Skyline Council of Landmarks, Illinois, which is our young leaders group. And thankfully, we were able to get the support of our Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic, Blair Keeman from Chicago Tribune, who said, hey, Evanston, wake up. You can do better than this. And through a long advocacy campaign over 5 years, we were able to save the Harley Clark Mansion. And now it's being reused by author Audrey Niffenegger as something called the Book House. So this one has a very positive end, but it just illuminated those challenges that I mentioned to you. And so, as I mentioned, we each need to step forward to do what we can to address these challenges in preservation, to find ways for it to evolve if we believe that indeed these problems are real, and to do what we can to find the next evolution for it to be relevant. You know, for me, what inspired me is not only, sitting back and counting these things, but saying that I have a responsibility to do something about it. Though these challenges are huge and sometimes really difficult to think how you might actually address affordable housing crises, how you might address the political matters around historic preservation ordinances. What can you do to take a step forward? So I just want to say that I was really inspired by this book, and I would encourage you all to read it if you haven't. It's called Be Fearless by Jean Case of the Case Foundation, and it's about leaders who have gone beyond their comfort zone to do incredible things, to be bold and to be fearless, like Seidel and like Jeff. So this work really matters. And if we are going to do something about it, we have to be bold. And so I really developed a thought of how I was going to do that. And I'm going to pepper into this presentation, everybody, some inspirational quotes from this book. And I hope they'll continually inspire you as we come to the end of this presentation to take your own steps forward. What I decided to do to move forward was really to identify if I was the only one seeing these problems. I didn't want to assume that every place has the same issues in preservation or that everybody sees what I saw. So I said, I'm going to go talk to people. And thankfully, this was our 50th anniversary, as I mentioned, in 2021. We were preparing to celebrate this anniversary. And our board of directors and my team said, yes, we want to use this moment as a mandate to look at our future and to find out what we need to do to evolve as an organization. And so I asked if I could take a 2-week sabbatical, essentially, and was fortunate to receive a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Peter H. Brink Mentoring Fund. And for 2 weeks, I traveled to 14 states and interviewed 23 people to ask these questions. Are you seeing the same thing? Is this solely in the Midwest, or is this on the East Coast, the South? Is it in the Northeast? And what I found from that is that, yes, the things that I was seeing, really other people were seeing, but they also had challenges that went beyond what I saw in my region. But they also had very creative solutions to these problems. And as I learned, they didn't know what somebody in Pennsylvania was doing in Los Angeles, or in New York City, what was happening in New Orleans, because we're spending so much time as preservationists trying to solve the issue, trying to put out the fire, that we don't have time to look for the solution oftentimes. And it's such a big problem at times, it makes us wonder how we can even chip away at it. So the lesson I learned was that it would really be helpful to this field if we had a location, if we had a guidebook to the solutions that people were using to solve these issues. So I asked if I could continue this work, and thankfully the James Marston Fitch Charitable Foundation out of Columbia University awarded me their 2020 Mid-Career Fellowship, as Margaret mentioned. And that was an incredible gift to be given the sanction, essentially, that this work was important and resources to continue this research. And I will tell you, the people I talked to were so generous. They continued to identify who else I should speak with. It's like, well, they called 2 people and they called 2 people and you need to call this person. And eventually 23 interviews turned into 130 over a 2-year period. And I'll have to say that certainly COVID-19 gave us incredible challenges and difficulties at the nonprofit sector. But what it did do for me in this project is it introduced me to Zoom like this. I didn't use it before, and it helped me to actually talk with far more people than I would have if I had to fly hither and yon to talk with every person. Plus, it's a much more environmental solution. So I'm just giving you a snapshot of some of the people that I spoke to, but I want to say thank you to the 130 people who donated their time to this project and for spending hours of their time with me to discuss how we can evolve preservation. And I'll go through some of the key findings in just a moment coming out of these interviews. So additionally, I want to say, who was being interviewed. So you saw some photos of them. I just wanted to say that it was important to me to talk to a wide range of people who were both, let's say, inside and outside of preservation, because it's not only what we think about ourselves, it's also what others perceive of us that is going to drive the future of this field. And so I also wanted to craft this as a way to hear from voices that are often not heard in preservation, those who have been marginalized in our work. Oftentimes people of color, LGBTQ community, young people, people of different socioeconomic status. So I tried to make sure we had equal. So about half of those voices are people we might not hear from or haven't driven decisions that were made in the past. You might ask, and it's a very good question, about something called confirmation bias. So if there are any social scientists out there, I'm sure you're writing that in the chat right now. And confirmation bias is essentially when you pick out interview subjects that are just going to confirm what you already think. And so it's important to me to be cognizant that that exists, and in talking with people to make sure that I was identifying a range of perspectives. So in this project, there are those who believe preservation is very good as it is and might need a few tweaks, and those who go all the way to the other side who think it needs to be completely dismantled and we need to start all over again. So there was everybody in between to ensure that this was really a wide-ranging and as unbiased as possible look at preservation. But ultimately, to a person, everyone felt that there were changes that needed to be made in our practice, in preservation practice. So I wanted to spend the majority of my time talking about these key findings and getting your feedback from this process. And what it continues to lead to, of course, are more questions. Just want to say this project is not done. And what I learn in every time I talk about it is that there are just more questions that we need to answer. But what's important is that we just get started. It is important to take steps forward and to take what we've learned through your feedback and find ways that each one of us can take a step forward. So the findings really fall into 4 different areas that I've listed out here for you. And essentially what it comes down to in my mind is that we need to expand who is involved in making decisions around place in our communities. That we need to ensure that this work is done fairly, justly, and that it meets people where they are, not necessarily where we want them to be. That we need to be more of a solution for the critical issues that are facing humanity. This is not to say that we are not a solution, but we believe, many of us, that we could do more. We can be more and partner with more people to solve these humanity crises that we have. And finally, that we need to build our next generation of leaders in preservation. There are many who are retiring in our field, and we don't have time to do succession planning. So I'm going to cover some of the specific points that have been raised, and just note that this is coming from 130 different people, but 300 pages of notes actually from those interviews. So there's a lot in there that I won't be able to cover as well. But I think these are the most important things. So building an inclusive and accessible preservation movement. We note, if you have ever been a manager, for example, that the most diverse teams are the strongest, that we can actually make better decisions. We have different perspectives around the table. And I believe that's absolutely true in preservation, that the diversity of our field is actually going to make our impact stronger. And that will be able to do, I think, what many of us want to, which is help people save the places that are special to them, that are about their history and their identity. And that may be a place that's very different from one that's been surveyed before. We need to find more information, have help identifying places that are important to others, expand the definition of preservation, and also engage people in making decisions about what they feel is important. So it was identified, early surveys that were done in preservation were oftentimes just based on architecture, based on what we could see. That's what the windshield survey was. And oftentimes we're missing that time to go and do the historic research so that we can learn what stories may be embedded in the place. And also that the lexicon of importance, architectural and aesthetic importance, is coming from a Western mentality. And that may not be indicative of what other communities feel is beautiful or important as well. So how do we expand our definition of what is significant? We need to embrace, of course, more people in this process to also ensure that there's a future for the incentives that we have, the regulatory, the public policy, because more voices around the table help to improve that legislation so that everybody can be involved. And we recognize not all of those regulations are understandable. Not all of them are accessible. That language can be Byzantine when you try to read it. And they oftentimes need people like Preservation Pennsylvania or Landmarks Illinois to help understand what it all means. And to do a much better job, we need to break down that system so it's much easier to understand, so people don't need to go through us, even though we want to be helpful, that they don't need to, because we end up being gatekeepers oftentimes to resources. So that language and communication is important. As you know, words matter, as you hear. And I wanted to give you an example of this that was very prominent in the last year and a half here in Chicago, for example. So the very words that we use can be detrimental and offensive to how people view historic preservation. I'm showing you a picture of the proposed Obama Presidential Center, which is proposed for Jackson Park, which is listed on the National Register for Historic Places. It's an Olmsted landscape where the 1893 World's Fair took place. And here, the proposed Obama Presidential Center is, of course, seen as a real boon to this city, and especially on the south side of Chicago, where President Obama made his mark as a community organizer. There has been a regulatory review process through Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. And the point of that is to bring lots of people together to talk about the impact, positive and negative, of proposed projects. So here, I was at a public meeting where it was noted that this is considered an adverse effect to the historic park. And there was a public comment about how offensive that language was, not recognizing, of course, that, you know, to us, that's language that's just something we use on a daily basis in regulation, but that by calling something so significant to a population of people who elected President Obama, that was a negative connotation automatically for historic preservation. The language matters. To create an equitable preservation movement. Sorry, I'm trying to block out the sun, everybody. The sun finally showed here in Chicago today. So to build an equitable preservation movement, there needs to be recognition that basic human needs need to be met before preservation can be a priority. I just had this conversation with a former preservation planner here in the city, recognizing that we may want to come in and make preservation the priority. But if housing needs are difficult and challenging and there isn't access to safe and affordable housing, that is most likely going to be the priority. How do we contribute to a solution so that we can build a preservation solution around housing? For example, affordable housing and preservation oftentimes can go hand in hand. Meeting people where they are, just talking about that conversation about adverse effect, is recognizing that preservationists tend to have a lot of jargon, that it can be, again, Byzantine to go through our regulations. How do we help simplify that process? Not dumb it down, but just make sure that the language is clear and that people can find information on their own as well. And that there's self-determination in the community about what they want to preserve. So here, oftentimes it's planning departments, it might be the State Historic Preservation Office, it may be the zoning department that is looking at how the future of land use is going to be in a community, and not the community itself that's making a decision. So that's very important to many of those that I interviewed. So preservation has a tie, as I was just mentioning, for land use. I was going to articulate this last point. Preservation is tied to land use policy. And of course, it's an overlay zoning for most historic districts, if that's how they're called in your community. So here, I'm bringing you a photo of a social justice artist named Tanika Lewis Johnson, and she is working on the south side of Chicago in the Englewood neighborhood to identify what was an inequitable and really illegal practice of land use or land sale contracts, which I won't go into the definition of those, but it was essentially the plunder of Black wealth in Chicago and elsewhere. And she wanted to landmark one of these buildings as indicative of the significance in cultural history and beginning to repair this, having reparations for this unjust practice, illegal practice, essentially. And was told by some of the commissioners on the Landmarks Commission that it would not be eligible because of our criteria. And so she created a land marker system. That's what you see here. She's putting up a land marker so that she can identify this as significant. And right there is an example of how we would want historic preservation to embrace the cultural relevance of this practice and helping to repair that history. Solving critical issues, the one that comes up the most, of course, is how we can contribute even more to combating climate change and the practice of environmental justice for those who have been systematically targeted for polluting practices, for example. That has a land use implication, and oftentimes those are historic neighborhoods as well. looking at any way that we can provide better access to housing through historic preservation, and looking at how we may contribute. Do we contribute to displacement and gentrification? Many of those I interviewed either have evidence or believe that historic districts may contribute to displacement in our communities. So we need to know the facts of that and then address it from a policy standpoint. I also want to bring up, these are not all urban issues. The concerns, I talked with many rural communities, I spoke with tribal representatives, and depopulation is a significant concern that has an impact on the resources, the historic building resources in a community. So depopulation is something that threatens the built environment and, of course, people's interaction and connection with that built environment. So in what ways are we contributing to combating depopulation, or helping to ensure that the intellectual capacity, that brain drain that happens, you reverse that so that rural communities have a fighting chance as well. I just wanted to point out one issue that we deal with here at Landmarks Illinois that's climate change related, is with the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe. We have a easement on this property, and the easement, of course, is protecting the building, but it is adjacent to the Fox River, which continues to flood and actually is flooding more frequently at the 500-year flood mark. So there's conversation about lifting it out of the way. Do you move it, et cetera, et cetera. And this is just indicative of conversations I know that are happening all around the coasts as sea level rise is happening. And what do we do to protect the culturally significant, historically significant resources that are going to be underwater? That's just one of the aspects of preservation that we feel we need to address to be more relevant. And finally, sustaining the future of our work. We identified that we need education for all ages, from little kids to adults, and talking about the significance and importance of place to people and why preserving place is significant. We don't always communicate that in a way that's effective, unfortunately. And hopefully we can get more people interested in this work, because we need to build a bigger constituency around preservation. So it's not seen as a luxury, it's seen as a necessity. And training more people in doing the work. So even if we're able to preserve a place, we may not have somebody skilled at that thing that needs to be done. So working on preservation trades training, which is a significant aspect of the National Impact Agenda, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and also the National Preservation Partners are working on preservation trades training policy as well. We have to address funding because this hand-in-mouth approach for preservation organizations just leads us to make decisions that are based on resources and where we can find them. We don't always make the most strategic decisions if we're always just looking for how to pay our payroll. In addition to that, the Historic Preservation Fund, which pays for our state historic preservation offices, our National Register program, our certified local government program, is funded by offshore oil lease revenues. And how sustainable is that funding source in the long-term future? So that is a conversation I know that is being had at the federal level, and we need to continue to talk about a replacement source of funding for our preservation policy and regulators. Finally, I talked about burnout. We've seen a number of executive directors, the rest of our team during the Great Resignation, bowing out of preservation work, and they're not alone as more and more people retire out of the field as well. How are we planning to ensure that that institutional memory is passed on to somebody else, and that we light a fire in the next generation to take on this important work as well? And here's a picture of our Skyline Council of Landmarks Illinois. This is how we're trying to contribute. We have this incredible group of emerging or young professionals that have agency within our organization to make their own decisions about what they want to do, what they want to preserve. Here they are in front of the Harley Clark mansion, going back to the beginning of my speech, where they held a heart bombing. And a heart bombing is where they show some love for a vacant building and help to demonstrate that there was a significant amount of support behind preservation, thus leading the city to understand that they had political pressure to reuse this building. So the next steps in the Relevancy Project, the project that I've talked about, is essentially to take all of this data, this information, and continue to analyze it and put it forward in blog posts so that I continue to share this to gather feedback, constructive criticism, and then integrate that feedback into the creation of the Relevancy Guidebook. So the guidebook is going to essentially have a number of practical solutions that a person can take, small steps that you can take forward to addressing these big issues. Because otherwise, if you feel like it's a big, hairy problem that's so big you can't tackle it, we are going to be paralyzed from moving forward. We just have to take a step forward. And so there are many, wonderful organizations that are working at the policy level to change preservation, between the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions that Mindy is on the board on, the National Trust I mentioned and their National Impact Agenda, the Partners Network with their Preservation Priorities Task Force. We have academics that I want to say thank you to: Erica Avrami, Jeremy Wells, Fallon Samuels Idu in New Orleans, as well as Randy Mason at Penn University, who are all working toward that policy solution. What I hope to contribute with this guidebook was really some small steps. Instead of policy level, how do we pair that with the practical, where you can take a step based on where you are in your organization, what's the readiness to move forward with these items, and just publishing some ideas for people. So at this point, got about 120 ideas in a running list, and it just continues to grow as I analyze those interviews with the interviewees. So I just wanted to show you a couple of those that we have started to take at Landmarks Illinois that are very possible to move forward with. Publishing our values, we put together something called our guiding principles that we published on our website that you can see, or I can put it in the chat later. Building boards and staff that are representative of the communities we serve. Evaluating our procurement practices. We did something called a spend diagnostic, looking at where our money goes and how we can use even our small amount of money to encourage the growth of diverse contractors who can continually contribute to the intellectual capital within preservation, for example, the knowledge base and those working in preservation. Just a couple of others. I know Sarah Marsom, one of my interviewees, would want us to say, pay your interns. It's very important to make sure that there's pay equity in preservation. We're paying our interns. And also she would say, make sure we're publishing the salaries on all of our job descriptions as well. But further, making sure we have diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility training and certification that we're offering, joining the Climate Heritage Network, which is a very easy step you can take. So these are all individual concepts that you can move forward with at your organization or as an individual. So I'm looking forward to publishing this hopefully later this year so that together we can take steps to fix preservation. As I worked toward publishing this information, I had a hashtag called Let's Fix Preservation. And it was my way to say that I do think preservation is fixable. I do think that we have the capacity to evolve into the next relevant version of what preservation needs to be if we all take steps to do that together. And I'll end with this proverb, which is in the book, Be Fearless Again, which I highly encourage, that we all have to work on this together. It can't be one person who changes a movement. We need to be a movement who are changing ourselves, because if we don't, somebody else will. But I'm very hopeful that together we will be able to do this as a community and ultimately help people save places that matter to them. So I want to thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and your feedback. I just want to say thank you. This is a moment for me to give credit to our annual corporate sponsors who sponsor everything we do at Landmarks Illinois. And they really deserve credit amongst those who are individual donors to our organization. Those donations are so important to us. And I just want to put a pitch in to please support Preservation Pennsylvania with your gifts. Mindy and Sabra and the board need your support so that they can continue to implement that new and exciting strategic plan that they just talked about. I'm ending with this slide. This is my contact information. And I'm happy to hear from you. I've got my Twitter handle. I have my cell phone, my email address. You can find this information on our website as well at landmarks.org to hear your feedback. If you want to consider this, contemplate it a little further, I will give the presentation to Sabra so she can publish it as well. And you can come back later with your comments if you're not ready to do so today. So again, thank you so much. And I am looking forward to the Q&A session, Mindy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. It's actually great to be here sharing a screen with you. Bonnie and I go a long way back, but when I started at Preservation Pennsylvania in 2006, Bonnie was the executive director of the Preservation statewide in Minnesota, and we had a little bet going. Both of our organizations and our states had been trying for many years, 15, 14 years at that time, to establish our first state historic tax credit. So Bonnie and I made a little bet to see which one of us was going to make it first. She did win. She won in 2010. We had ours eventually enacted in 2012. And I promised I was going to knit her a sweater. Sorry, still haven't gotten that sweater.
That's all right, Mindy. We passed a tax credit in Illinois as well. So I just wanted to say that, any place we go, we need to pass tax credits.
Yes. So Bonnie, I know you said you have 120 ideas, but if you could say, what is one thing, what's the call to action? What is one thing an individual can do to sort of start this process of fixing preservation?
I would advise that you just consider where you feel preservation is in your profession or your life, and decide who you would like to work with, and that can often help you. Who can you partner with, like a Preservation Pennsylvania, of course, to leverage your volunteerism or your resources to have an even greater impact. So it's important to have numbers in this process, and talk with you. I'm plugging for Preservation Pennsylvania to plug the strategic plan and take steps to encourage that strategic plan to go forward. Otherwise, beyond just joining an organization and their efforts, I really think it's important to have a voice in preservation, and that is often whether that's your local government, whether that's your Congress people, talking with even local banks about the importance of having financing for this work, just making your voice heard in some way.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting that both Sidel and Jeff mentioned turning hearts and minds. So my question before I turn to some of the others that we received is, what's your advice for reaching new hearts and minds?
Mm-hmm. There are many ways to do that. And why I say that is not to skirt the issue, everybody, but to say that it's really important to take a moment to understand with whom you're speaking, and to take a moment to step back and listen. So the person with whom you're engaging may be coming to preservation or this conversation from a very different perspective than you are. And that's the meeting people where they are. So being able to identify the approach as far as language that we might use, and what may be important to that person. That's how we change hearts and minds. It's not by saying we're important, preservation is relevant. It's really about stepping back, being humble, listening, and when a community identifies what they want and need, that's what we should do.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have some questions rolling in now. In cities and places that are experiencing growth and intense development pressure, how did interviewees gauge appetite for density and rezoning within the context of historic preservation?
Sure. Thanks for that question, because I do want to recognize that, I spoke with people in many of the country's large cities, and certainly there's a diversity of issues that they're facing. Even within my own city of Chicago, there's not one problem that we have in every neighborhood. There are different problems within different neighborhoods. What I would say, though, is that with regard to the quote unquote hot areas of a city, and especially on the east or the west coast, excuse me, the the integration of density is a very important step forward for preservation if we can adopt a mentality that density is not bad. And that is because there's a group called the Yes in My Backyard. So YIMBY, you might have heard NIMBY before, not in my backyard. So YIMBYs want to embrace any way to create affordable housing. And that includes densifying single family residential districts. And when we come at that and say no, no, no to all density, it really does position us as the movement of no, and that we oftentimes are considered that we don't care about affordable housing or housing access. So I would just say the one thing to look at, or that we've learned about, is the accessory dwelling unit legislation. So we had that in Chicago. This is where you can increase the number of housing units on a piece of land without necessarily demolishing the home that is there. So finding ways to, as Jeff said, get to a yes. It might be a compromise or seen as a compromise, but I feel like we need to radically embrace that housing is a right for everyone. And how do we get ourselves there to embrace density even in historic districts?
Thank you. We have a question. Is the word preservation a turnoff to younger people? Is it backward? Is it backward looking?
I would, in the experience of talking with people, I would say that it certainly varies. There are a number of people, though, who feel that the term preservation just does not reflect who we are or what we do. And the attempt to find some other way to define what it is, but to my knowledge, no one has quite found the exact way to do that in a way that's been adopted in a social media, for example. So yes, some people consider preservation to be a term that is associated, as you saw in the presentation, associated with white supremacy, associated with systemic racism. And that, of course, is not a term that they would want to use. So I think that the approach we've taken within our organization is to see how we can redefine the word preservation, and using that approach to identify what we do, how we do it, and how we want to expand what we do. So I just say that that's one approach you could take.
We have a question about the National Register, and going back to the fact that the National Register seems to always be like the gateway, that things don't happen if you're not eligible. So I would say right now the process is too complicated, takes too long, takes too many resources and money, too much priestly knowledge. Until that gate can be opened, we will continue to face inequities. Comments, thoughts?
So yes, again, amongst a lot of people that I spoke with, I'm just going to say that that was a general consensus as well, that the National Register of Historic Places is a difficult tool, and it's not an equitable tool, in that the places that may want to be listed to have access to incentives, for example, may not be able to be listed because they were not surveyed in the first place. They have had a number of changes that have been made, and now you're bumping up against the integrity criteria. So the requirement to have integrity and the criteria don't seem to be the issue. It's really about what we require people to have kept, and then the access to historical consultants, which, as you mentioned, are expensive, and that's oftentimes what is necessary to list a place on the National Register. So I think our approach is to look at other mechanisms to identify significance. And there are conservation districts, of course, that have been discussed, but what are ways to either adapt the National Register, create a new kind of resource, or again, decouple some of these incentives so that you could access them without being listed in the National Register. So those are all some policy level conversations.
Okay. This is with regard to the Obama Center. Precision in language is important, especially if it is going to court. Obama Center is absolutely an adverse effect under 106. Perhaps a qualifying paragraph should have been added to ensure that the precise meaning of this is understandable to the average person.
Mm-hmm. Now, thank you for that. I couldn't agree more that I think the average person is not likely to go to the Federal Register and pick out the definitions section of that particular regulation to look at the definition. So either it should be brought forward to clarify or to even, again, identify how to talk about that in, sort of plain English about what exactly that means and why. So it was so profound to me to be standing in that public meeting and to hear how vocal people were about the offensiveness of this language. And it hit me that at that moment, how much that language is something that I was trained in it, in my field, but can be offensive to somebody who's not doing this on a daily basis.
All right, thank you, Bonnie. I think that answers all the questions. We really appreciate it. We will be looking forward to following your progress on the Relevancy Project. Roy, did you have a question for Bonnie? You're muted. You're muted, Roy.
Yeah, I guess actually what I was going to say is that, yeah, the National Register can be a real pain to deal with, but if you don't have local preservations engaged and you don't have local preservation organizations and local preservation ordinances, then the National Register is not really going to do that much to help your overall historic preservation program.
Yeah, thank you, Roy. That is certainly a misnomer for some people about the National Register, about what it does and does not do. And I think we have a responsibility to talk about that because many people have just become sold on the idea that if it's listed in the register, it's never going to be demolished. And as we know, that is not the truth. We need to talk about the truth of the resources and tools that we have. So thank you for that.
And I'd like to echo Roy's comments. Many people in Whitemarsh thought that because the Corson Homestead was listed on the National Register and that the district was the first registered district in Pennsylvania, that was all the protection we needed. It was totally useless. The protections that came into play were the ones available through the local historic district designation. And then there was also this interesting interplay between Army Corps of Engineers finding with regard to waters of the United States and the National District Register listing. There was the potential, because it was a National Register property, to trigger a 106 investigation. But the developers' attorneys did everything within their power to claim that it wasn't the homestead that was listed, it was just the buildings. So
yes,
interesting little twist that we had to contend with. So yes, I would say do not rely on that National Register listing, although indeed there are resources that can be brought to bear, grants and other support as a result of the listing, but getting to the point where you're listed is onerous.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much, Bonnie. Please stick around for the overview of our 40th anniversary. Today marks the official kickoff of our 40th anniversary celebration. Throughout 2022, we'll look back at our beginnings and highlight some of our most significant successes. From our first Preservation Fund loan to put a roof on the William Wells Young Memorial School in York County, to a review of 30 years of our Pennsylvania at-risk list, highlighting many projects that went from at-risk to award recipients. We're planning a series of webinars, some members-only events, some special tours, and some exciting announcements. We'll be sharing our vision for the future and inviting you to be part of the planning and discussion. Today, we are opening applications for our 2022 Pennsylvania at-risk listing. Deadline is March 9th, and details can be found on our website. The 2022 Pennsylvania at-risk list will be announced during Preservation Month in May. Later in the spring, we'll open up applications for our 2022 Pennsylvania Historic Preservation Awards that will take place in the fall. This year, we'll be focusing on projects that highlight 40 years of our programs and the successes of our members and supporters. We have some exciting developments with at-risk properties that we'll be able to announce very soon after months and actually sometimes years of working behind the scenes. An example, the East Broad Top Railroad was placed on our very first Pennsylvania at-risk list in 1992. It only took 28 years, but it was finally saved in 2020. So we're going to be doing a webinar with the great folks that are rebuilding this amazing National Historic Landmark. So details will be coming soon. In June, we're excited to do an event in collaboration with the Preservation League of New York State. We're going to be hosting a webinar with Dr. Whitney Martinko, who is a Villanova professor and author of Historic Real Estate, Market Morality, and the Politics of Preservation in the Early United States. Dr. Martinko is also working with one of our at-risk sites, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Cumberland County. If you are already a Preservation Pennsylvania member or donor, I thank you very much. We simply could not continue our work without your sustaining support. We are not funded by the state. We do not receive any operating income from large foundations or the PHMC. 65% of our operating income comes from you, people like you who value preservation's rich heritage and want to see it preserved. So if you are not yet a member or donor, or if your membership is lapsed, now's the perfect time to join or renew by visiting our website. Members will be receiving bi-monthly anniversary updates with exclusive opportunities to participate. Join the fun and support this important work. Please sign up for our e-news if you don't already receive it. I'd like to thank the members of our 40th anniversary committee, Margaret Wallace, Chair, Brenda Barrett, Caroline Boyce, Jen Burden, Julie Fitzpatrick, Darlene Heller, Melinda Meyer, Sandy Rosenberg, and Philip Zimmerman. And advisory committee members, Mary Donati, Tom Rapon, and Paul Stanke. They are working with the board and staff to plan a great year. I look forward to celebrating with all of you. And again, congratulations to Sidel and Jeff.
Thank you for joining us today. We have a lot to celebrate in the coming year, and we have a very bright future. We invite you to support our work, as Mindy says, through donations and membership. And we hope you will join us throughout the year as we celebrate our past and look forward to our future. Thank you again for all attending today.